Chapter 10, we'll be talking about international integration, and more specifically, we'll be looking at the European Union, which is a good example of this international integration concept. What we're looking at here is supranational organizations that are what you might say subsuming states and their functions within a larger whole, typically on a regional basis. The UN is a global example of an international organization that has some of these supranational aspects, but it is limited somewhat, and sovereignty still is the overriding norm there, that all the states have their sovereignty and will willingly or voluntarily choose to integrate in certain aspects. The World Trade Organization is another modest example of this integration concept, where they are challenging sovereignty somewhat over trade issues, where states are complying with the rules of the WTO, or the WTO provides somewhat of an oversight or a referee type function in the trading system. Integration theory is the process by which these supranational institutions replace national ones. And this may be in retraction somewhat, as we see a lot of countries kind of pulling back towards more nationalist sentiments. But the EU is the most successful example of this integration theory to date, and they've been having their problems as well. UK has decided to exit from that. But there was a lot of history in Europe that precipitated the formation of the European Union. We'll look at the history here in a few minutes, but many centuries of chronic intermittent warfare in Europe. World War I, World War II were very devastating to Europe. So what they're looking at, trying to get everybody together on that continent to try to prevent something like that from happening again. And we're starting to first look at technical and economic functions that are integrated, crossing borders, that may eventually integrate their political functions, but that's been pretty difficult to do. And we'll see that one of the problems with the EU is that the political functions are more difficult to come together. The United States is a good example of where they did it the opposite direction, where they put their political integration together first, and then everything followed from that. Their theory is that the economic integration would drive the political dynamics, but that is very difficult to do. We see that each state maintains its own sovereignty. The EU has evolved over a fairly long period of time. Started off in the early 50s as the European Coal and Steel Community amongst those few states. Treaty of Rome in 1957, they called it the European Economic Community. In 1962, they created what was the Common Agricultural Policy that included price supports on certain goods to subsidies for the farmers in all the EU states. So they were trying to get all the European states together on these particular policies. By 1969, they had a goal of a customs union where all of the European states would be unified and have the same set of tariffs. So unified trade policy there. In 1971, they added a few more states, including the UK at that time, and renamed it the European Community. The Maastricht Treaty in 1992 was what we now formally call the EU, where they decided to get the states together with a monetary union and a central bank to follow, opening up of the borders for labor and immigration flows, things like that, and to start the political integration as well as building a military. That has, of course, progressed considerably slower. The central bank, which would operate much like the Federal Reserve in the United States would function. It was formed in 1999, and then 2002, the euro replaced the national currency in 17 states. So that means that there are a few states that's still not on the euro. 2013, Croatia became its latest 28th member. There's a map showing the original members and then what progressively how they joined. Candidating countries include Turkey, which is having its problems, is pretty much stagnated on its attempts to join the EU. If you looked at the EU as its own economic entity, it would be very large and very powerful. You can see the largest economies. EU would be the second largest economy if it was totally unified as an economic entity there. Looking at the structure of the EU, the European Council is simply the summit meetings where all of the heads of states meet on a sporadic basis to kind of give a general direction of policy. But the three main working groups are the European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, and the European Commission, which is its administrative arm, and they report to the European Council. The summit meetings there. We'll also look at the Court of Justice here in a minute. Let's look at the three main bodies of the EU. Council of Ministers, where these are ministers from all 28 states, main legislative body. You're looking at the economic, foreign, criminal justice policies. They're making the treaties, adopting laws, setting the budget. They do a lot of this co-decision making with the Parliament, which is the elected body of the EU that has evolved over time in order to perhaps satisfy people around Europe that they're not being represented in the EU. So elections gradually started to occur, and then elected bodies from, or at least an elected part of the EU was the Parliament. We'll get to in a minute. But they coordinate the policies with that other group, and they have an administrative staff called the General Secretariat, which is led by a Secretary General. Also, the Council of Ministers, a lot of decisions are made by what is called a double majority, where you have, in order for a policy to pass, you've got 55% of member states have to go for it, as well as 65% of the EU's population would have to agree to it as well. Looking at the Parliament, which is the legislature, functions similar to our Congress would function. There's 751 members. Based on population of each state, 500 represents 500 million total people there in Europe. They are elected for 5-year terms. Germany, the most highly populated state, has 96 seats. Several smaller states have 6 seats minimum there. And just with any elected representative body, we see the growing influence of political parties, some of which are anti or skeptic of EU, which is part of the challenge. Also, the Parliament, much as the Congress does in the American system, they serve as a oversight or watchdog over the administrative arm, which is the commission that we'll talk about here in a minute. They have the power to approve the budget. So similarly, we have these separations of powers where the council and commission would propose budgets and the Parliament, the elected body, would approve the budget. And as I mentioned before, they have a co-decision power with the Council of Ministers that's evolved over time in order to have the European citizens feel a little bit more represented. The Commission is the administrative arm similar to our executive branch in the United States. It administers the policy that's adopted by the Council, but it also has a little bit more power in that it proposes legislation as well. There's 28 commissioners, one from each member state, that are overseeing the administrative arm here. Has a staff of about 25,000 people, a budget of about 154 billion, and that compares to New York State's budget of about 149 billion. So that gives you a comparison, considering this is administering the continent of Europe. And just like any bureaucratic arm of the government, it has gathered lots of criticism, lots of regulations. We do see that in the European mindset, they do seem to get a little bit more meticulous when it comes to regulations. We'll mention here in a minute how they had tried to write a European Union constitution, and it got so big and unwieldy that it failed. Looking at the numbers of the European Parliament, total 751 representatives, and the bigger states, Germany, France, have the highest number of members, Italy, based on population, Spain, Poland, UK, 73 members will be going away. That will be official sometime this year. Now let's look at the European Court of Justice, which is independent arm of interpreting the law, much like our Supreme Court functions in the United States. Again, we have 28 judges, one from each member state, and they have an established jurisdiction over their particular territories. 90% of the cases are heard by a 3 to 5 judge panel. So that allows for them to see more cases, about 500 per year, as compared to the United States, which only hears about 75 to 80 cases per year, because all 9 of our Supreme Court justices sit over each individual case one at a time. So here they've broken it up a little bit to allow for more cases. And they do have the power to overrule national laws that conflict with the EU law. And this still to this day is somewhat controversial within some states that still feel like that violates their sovereignty somewhat. So that's why the EU is still fighting an uphill battle in order to create this concept of a supranational organization, or even something that's similar to the United States of Europe, perhaps. Lots of concerns as a result. Already talked about the attempt at a constitution that failed in 2005 because it just got too big, too detailed. Whereas when you compare our Constitution, just less than 20 pages, fairly concise, but that does leave a lot of room for interpretation. In the European culture, they tried to get more detail, and it just did not work out. There was opposition to Turkey's potential membership for various reasons, Islamic influence perhaps, as well as some other democratic functions that they have to meet. But Turkey has been having its problems since that time, probably been put on the back burner. Every state is concerned with the loss of their sovereignty, this democratic deficit. They've been trying to resolve that by electing representatives to parliament, but the turnout for those elections is it's even smaller than in the United States. And we see that when each state has its own political policies, they are going to disagree over certain immigration policies or agricultural subsidies. And as a result, it's seeing some nationalist sentiments within their states, and including the United Kingdom, which voted to leave the EU a couple of years back. And it took them quite a bit of negotiations to work out that agreement to leave. Economic concerns. Some states, including Britain, opted to retain their own currencies, so that did not fully integrate their monetary policy. And with the recession, even though they were trying to integrate economically, there's quite a bit of difference in political implementation of these policies, which is what's preventing them from being on the same page more so than anything else. Unemployment varied quite widely, up to 11% Slovakia, low as 5% in the Netherlands. The EU does not have the centralized powers of taxation or control of national budgets. So we're seeing some of the same issues here that the United States had to deal with a long time ago with its Articles of Confederation in order to give the central government more power to do things like this. EU still does not have that. And one of the issues that Britain had was the dues, the back dues. It had balked at a recent request for an additional $2 billion to the EU budget, contributed to the populist sentiment in Britain to pull away from the EU. And just like with any other power rule in nature and human behavior, we see that just a handful of states are providing the vast majority of the GDP output. 3 states there, France, Germany, Italy, make up about 2/3 of the Eurozone output. These are the states that are using the euro, and then these are the states not using the euro. The increased anti-Muslim sentiment, particularly with the Syrian war and all the refugees that were coming out of that increased some of that populist anti-immigration sentiment in the first place, and then the anti-Muslim sentiment came on top of that as well through the immigration and refugee crises and concern for terrorist attacks from the fundamentalists in these areas. The leaders have pushed what we call a neo-functionalist top-down approach, which has not really helped the grassroots idea of building a European nation. So that was still very controversial, considering that it probably would never get done if you did not have this neo-functionalist top-down approach. Comparing that to the United States, we would probably not be here if you had not had a very select handful of people that came down and said, okay, this is what we're going to create for our Constitution. As I said before, turnout for the parliamentary elections is very low, so still not a lot of support for that. And we see that a fairly good chunk of the EU Parliament, the seats are held by either what we call Eurosceptic or anti-EU parties. So that is a little ironic that we're electing people that want to disband the EU. The rise of nationalism in Europe, we can see that looking at some of these numbers here, percent of votes won by nationalist parties in the most recent elections. So it has been growing. There's no way to predict whether or not nationalist sentiments will continue to increase or that they may subside. Certain events can occur that bring people together that might downplay the nationalist desires and then start to spur a little bit more international or integrated type of operations. Looking at the parties in EU, we see that there are a few parties here that are, as I've already mentioned, looking at more skeptic or anti-EU policies. The Treaty of Lisbon in 2009 tried to make a few changes, whereas the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is similar to the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, they wanted to make that legally binding, and that would serve as its constitution. They also tried to promote a little bit more of this supranational decision making, but at the same time, the national parliaments of each individual state will have a little bit more to say as to who's admitted to the EU. And then more of an initiative or a direct democracy kind of approach, which is also trying to improve that democratic deficit that we talked about. The Commission must consider any proposal that's receiving 1 million signatures. With the issue of Brexit, there was a 2016 referendum where it was 52% for leaving the EU. Fairly reasonably good turnout there, 72%. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted to remain by substantial margins, so there could be some issues still coming up with those two regions as this exit continues. And the original target date was March 2019. Here we are a year later, and it's basically been decided by now. Issues continue to remain at that border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, whereas before, with both being members of EU, the borders were considered porous. Now there's going to have to be more of a boundary there. There's money, as I mentioned before, still owed to the EU, how that's going to be decided. And there are still UK citizens that are abroad in Europe, so that will have to be determined how that will be handled as well. Now, as far as the integration theory, we see that over the past few centuries, violence has declined, particularly as a percentage of the population. And we cannot necessarily explain this by evolution, because our human natures have not really changed significantly, but we do see that the age of reason was somewhat of a tipping point where we started to realize that if we created institutions that shaped our behavior as far as coordination and cooperation, then we saw that violence in war, conflict, started to decline. Prior to that, tribal violence was considerably more frequent. For example, murder rates in the year 1200 were about 24 per 1,000, and by the modern era, 0.6 per 1,000. So you can see that is a dramatic drop in general violence and conflict amongst humanity because of these ideas, institutions, political organization that we have formed since then. Here we're looking at the general decline. Now, obviously, during World Wars I and II, tremendous devastation and death. And right here we see that the Korean War also peaked again. We see that it peaked here, Vietnam War, peaks again during the 80s because of several anti-Soviet types of operations going on. In the 80s, we also had the Iran-Iraq War there. We also had Afghanistan, Soviet War, so activity going on there. We see it spikes again here with 9/11. If I was able to extend this a little bit, it probably would have spiked again here past 2010 because of the wars that are going on, particularly with Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, things like that. But generally, overall decline in battle-related deaths. The major theories behind this decreasing conflict are the civilizing influence of central governments getting people together, the general pacification of society when we delegate that monopoly of violence to the government. We also see that development, technology, specialization, they have put a higher value on human life. So that is another reason why conflict has decreased. The concept of non-zero-sum games promotes cooperation as opposed to a zero-sum game, which means I win and you lose, all of that. Whereas a non-zero-sum game means that we both win a little bit of something. And then if we start to understand and empathize with other cultures, we see that this moral circle of reciprocity being treating other people like you would want to be treated, we can start expanding that circle out into more groups. So we have to be careful. This is not a license for complacency because it's not necessarily in our human nature or that it's evolution that's making us less violent in general. We have to stay on top of it because this decline occurred because past generations had worked towards doing that. And we see that we still have pre-modern sensibilities, still driven by our System 1 thinking, remember, but we also have modern weapons that can kill a lot more people. So we cannot dismiss what this concept of banality of evil is that you can't tell somebody's evil just by looking at them. The common everyday people that go to work and have wives and kids can get caught up into this violence. So that wraps up chapter 10, which will be included on test number 2.